So the question I think we should start with is how we go about establishing the value of migrants to the UK.
And the first thing you say and have to say is there is no answer to the question, how valuable are migrants? Some migrants may be more valuable than other migrants at different times in different ways. So the way to approach this quite complicated topic, and there's a lot of economics on it, the way to approach it is to not ask how valuable are migrants or do we want migration, but where is migration valuable and where is it not valuable? That's the only way really to look at this. And I think for the purpose of this, we should separate out kind of, are migrants good for national income? Do they make us richer? Do they bring more into the economy than they take out? And then there's a separate question, which if your chance of the exchequer really matters, which is, do they bring in tax revenue to the economy? Do they make the public finances, the government's books? But the bigger question is, how much difference to the economy does migration make and in what ways? And I'm going to give you 2 or 3 cases where migration has a positive effect. Okay, so I'm not going to sort of lay out figures, but if migrants are very productive, so they may be entrepreneurs setting up businesses, it is highly likely they're making indigenous Brits richer when they come because they're creating jobs and they're creating income and they're spending money. So that is case number 1. If their contribution is way bigger than the average, very likely positive. The second and really important case is where the migrant people coming in are filling gaps in your economy. So here's the good story. You imagine that we are short of bus drivers, so British people can't get to work because they can't get a bus. If you can just import the bus drivers, you can unlock the jobs and affluence that the British workers might want. So if the migrants are somehow filling gaps in the economy, they can be making British people richer. And I'll give you a real world example. If you have a farmer who's got a farm with fields growing fruit and is good at farming, but can't pick the fruit, him or herself, being able to bring in migrant workers to do the picking, if no British workers are available for that, well, that makes the farmer's life easier and more valuable. So that's a sort of example.
But am I allowed to put a challenge in here?
Totally.
Which is that farmer, or whatever the business is, there are an awful lot of people sitting without jobs in the UK, and arguably, if enough was paid, they would do that job.
Correct. And that's why it's always important to say, even when a migrant comes in and does a job, and that benefits, say, the farmer or the bus company or the bus passenger, there are always losers from that migrant coming in. That would be the existing bus drivers or fruit pickers who think, I could be paid more for this if you didn't import workers. So there are always winners and losers. Absolutely have to remember that from migration. And yes, in the long term, if we want people to pick fruit, why aren't we just producing people who pick fruit? And if we can't find people who pick fruit, at a wage that entices them to do that, maybe we shouldn't be in the fruit business. That would be a perfectly logical argument. But
And can I add one other factor
go on.
And we're talking about the areas where there are gaps.
Yeah.
Depending, of course, and fruit pickers typically come over for a season and they go.
Yeah.
But if it's in an area where you are low paid and you are reliant on welfare for various other aspects, and of course you're reliant on the NHS if you get sick, you are squeezing out indigenous people as well, and you are costing the country more.
Correct. So this is why it's difficult to put a sort of precise result on all of this. I mean, let's go through the negative cases. Yeah, if your value is very low as a migrant worker, you're coming in and doing a very low value job, say below average, and it's not kind of on a critical position in the economy where you're unlocking other people's work, then you're probably not pulling up the economy. If you're not working at all, obviously, migration, if it's non-working migrants, they're not adding to the value of the economy.
And of course, we should say in many cases, asylum seekers are not allowed to work.
And that's absolutely true. And in all cases, I mean, this is the most striking conclusion. So we've got some positives and some negatives. In most cases, when you look at the actual migration we have, you do find slightly better disposition to work, I think, among migrants than the indigenous population. That's often because, you know,
They might have come here to work.
they came here to work, or they probably came here as adults, and so they've skipped the school bit of life, which is a sort of non-working bit of life. They've come in at a young adult age, and so they're a slightly higher propensity to work. But the key conclusion is a lot of the economics of this finds that the per capita effect of migration is really very small. They might add to the size of our economy, but obviously they add to the number of people you're trying to sustain as an economy. And when you say, what is our income per capita, the migration effect tends to be very small. If you look at some of the Office for Budget Responsibility's GDP estimates for with or without high levels of migration, the per capita differences are kind of tiny compared to sometimes the GDP effects. You know, you can have 1 million extra people, that's 1 million extra incomes, great. It's 1 million extra people needing income, not so good. So the GDP per capita isn't so great. So look, I mean, I think broadly speaking, you often find the effects are quite marginal. Okay. But there can be positives and there can be negatives.
I mean, the point you make about a migrant arriving after their education, because if you look at a typical person in the UK, they are a drain, according to the OBR, until about 20.
Correct.
And from there, they are sort of good for the economy, provided they're working, of course. And then they suddenly become a drain again.
Well, let's call it 65, 70, whatever, whenever they stop working. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the net effect over a lifetime, I mean, I find it's fascinating, isn't it? If you arrive at 20, you're already in an advantageous position compared.
Because you've got you're more likely to be working than a random person selected from the population because you're of working age. However, and this is again another reason why don't overstate the economic effects of migration one way or the other. After a generation of being here, of course, the migrant has kids and the kids are going to be going to school, just like an indigenous person. So in fact, you find over the sort of generations that migrants just become like the local population and it all washes out. So I think it's key not to sort of exaggerate economic effects from migration, but it's easy to see how they could be mildly positive if you're importing workers, and particularly workers filling shortages, gaps in the economy.
Okay, can I just add in the sending money home argument? Does that make much of a difference? Do we know?
It's a bit of a difference. Obviously, migrants often are sending money home, so they're not spending it here. I mean, if our economy is fully employed, it probably isn't going to matter very much because, you know, if they spent it here, we'd probably have to spend it less on something else. But I mean, it doesn't make a huge difference. I think it is important to say migration doesn't just affect the migrant and the local population. It also affects the population of the country they've left. So the sending money home alleviates some of the pain that they cause in the country they've left at the fact they've left. So if we take a doctor out of Ghana or a nurse out of Zimbabwe, we're taking skilled, trained people out of a country much poorer than ours. So at least them sending money home is, if you like, alleviating some of the kind of gap they've left in the country from which they've come.
Okay, and given the expense that actually is a loss to Ghana or Zimbabwe of their education, training as a doctor and a nurse, that's a huge boon.
I mean, that is a question we should always be asking ourselves. Are we basically getting a sort of aid from poor countries in that they train people to work in our labour force?
Okay, so there is, when you at the outset, you were talking about we should consider this in two ways.
Yeah.
The effect on the national income and the effect on the government finances. Yeah. Are both marginal then?
Well, I think they're both marginal, but there's a really important point about the government finances, that migration has been good in the government's books over the last, high levels of migration have been good for the government's books in the last 10 years. Primarily, though, for one very dodgy reason, which is this, that migrants come in, let's just suppose they're average workers like the rest of us. They've come in and they've paid tax. But of course, they do come in and they do have government expenditure requirements like health and like potentially education for their kids or welfare if they fall out of work. And one of the things we have done over the last decade is take in migrants, bank the tax, but we haven't increased public spending on the same scale as the population has grown. So, it's just basic arithmetic. We have assumed you can take the people in, enjoy the tax they pay, but we're not having to pay anything out to them. So what you've really done is just cut the
Spreading
effective
the pie
level.
further.
Yeah, you've spread the existing level of public spending between more people, and that has been a trick that I think is sort of unsustainable in the long term. But it is the case. I mean, look, I'll give you the Office for Budget Responsibility. If you make the assumption that you don't have to spend anything on migrants, so you don't increase public spending, they are very beneficial to the public finances because you get lots of extra tax revenue. I mean, the OBR looked at 350,000 extra people. They kind of changed their scenarios, looked at an extra 350,000 migrant extra population. They found that after a few years, that was adding 7 billion net to the government's finances. It's not game changing, but it's very nice to have for a chancellor, £7 billion. But that was on the assumption no welfare and no extra public spending. When you actually let public spending catch up with those migrants, and when those migrants have been here long enough to claim welfare or whatever it is, obviously that 7 billion doesn't get wiped out, but you're probably wiping out 2/3 or 3/4 of it.
Okay. So, very clear answers.
Really interesting question. No, look, it's not.
Interesting question. The arguments are going to continue.
Yeah, they will. They will.
Okay? Very good.